Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National League of Cities. My name is Clarence Anthony. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the National League of Cities, and we're so honored that Mayor Bowser and the entire city and community of our city, Washington, D.C., would find yourself in the National League of Cities. We call this your city hall away from home, so come and visit us anytime. This is a special opportunity for us as the National League of Cities because the work that you're doing really is it's just so important, not just to your work as professional and community leaders. It's about the people that live in the community. It's why we talk about resilience. And you've spent the last 2 years in making this happen, and it has taken input not just from the staff, but the residents, the local business leaders, as well as from national experts. And it's really not a small task to be able to pull together a vision that is inclusive to all of the community. So we at the National League of Cities is very pleased to be able to be a part of this process. You know, as a former mayor in Florida, before I moved here to Washington, I can tell you that as a local leader, it was very difficult at times to be able to pull together a plan that was strategic and that had outcomes attached to it. But it has to be more difficult if you're here in Washington, D.C., the home of FEMA and dozens of other national leading international nonprofits. And of course, your local newspaper that I'm getting used to over the last 5 years, the Washington Post. You just can't put out another resilience plan when you have that kind of pressure. You really have to have a plan that is implementable and effective to be able to include all of the residents of Washington, D.C. But for this plan to truly make an impact, I think we must first expand the definition of what we say and what we mean when we say the word resilience, because you actually have to put a face on it, especially for those people who may not understand that resilience is about improving the quality of life for every resident. Most often when we say the word resilience, we jump straight to climate, environmental, water. All of those things have an equity twist to it. But we got to make sure that we brand this plan in a way that even the least of these see themselves in the plan. Because if we are not able to do that, we're going to miss the mark. So resilience is not always about climate change or extreme weather. It also includes housing, access to transportation, clean, safe drinking water, the ability to bounce back and get an education when it exists in the city that you live. So the good news for us is that Mayor Bowser and her team has approached this plan and not just focused on the sustainability as it relates to water and in climate. They've been able to include the human part of it as well. So I also, when I reviewed it, found it very interesting or read a lot about what the city is doing. Your Equity Advisory Committee has made the first pillar not the word green or recycling or sustainable. They started with inclusivity, the word inclusivity. And we started in that way, and remember as we implement this plan that we must be inclusive to be successful. We must be inclusive if we're going to have real outcomes. I read a story about a young man named Walden Adams. For the first 30 years of his life living here in the district, he was homeless. And when the weather was bad, what he would do he would go into apartment buildings and get close to pipes so that he can get the heat and the warmth. But he was able to overcome because opportunity was provided to him in Washington, D.C. So our pathway forward, we must, and I'm going to keep stressing this, we must put a face to the plan. And we must expand, again, the definition of resilience. So, of course, Washington, D.C. is not the only city that is a part of creating a resilience plan. The 100 Resilient Cities program elevated this issue by working with major cities like New York, LA, Dallas, and of course, our hometown, Washington, D.C. The National League of Cities is not new to this work, and that's why we've been pushing it so hard. Our leaders in the past have talked and implemented resilient strategies, and we will continue to do that on the national level, whether you're in a large city or a small city. We also need federal partners. We need to work with our federal leaders to prepare our communities for the next 100 years. But to do that effectively, we must have everyone in this room and every citizen in Washington, D.C. to challenge ourselves to be ambitious about resilience and what we're doing. And I challenge everyone in this room that today we get a presentation, tomorrow we continue to work. I challenge us to look at processes around America because we need to see what Dallas is doing. We need to see what Orlando, Los Angeles is doing to make sure vulnerable populations are included. And finally, for our friends down the street in Congress, I challenge them to step up in ways to work with cities that they've never had before. I challenge our president to do the same. Local leaders are the ones that are addressing these issues, but we need a federal partner. And with that, I would say congratulations on development of this plan, and I'd like to welcome our mayor, Mayor Bowser, here to take the floor from here. Mayor Bowser, welcome.
Well, good morning, everybody. I am really delighted to be with you this morning, and I want to thank Clarence and his team here at the National League of Cities, who are so focused on making sure that mayors like me and administrations like ours have access to best practices, have access to a staff that is helping us solve our nation's biggest problems. So I want to thank you, Clarence, for your hospitality today. Michael and the team at the 100 Resilient Cities, also thanks to you for a multi-year partnership now. We were just thinking about when we met over video chat several years ago, and today we can celebrate really good work over the last couple of years. To our city administrator, Rashad Young, and Kevin Bush, our resilience officer, and our Resilient DC cabinet. I see a number of our cabinet officials here. I want to thank you too for your focus over the last several years and the work that we've been able to do together. I don't have to tell most people assembled here that our city is one of the strongest, most diverse, and most vibrant cities in the United States. And I am very proud to say that our city's growth and thriving economy make us the envy of many cities around the globe. For our growth and prosperity to continue, however, we must make sure that we are prepared for the unexpected and be resilient in the face of change and ongoing challenge. And we're proud that cities across the country increasingly look to Washington, D.C., our city, not the federal government, for leadership. And they look at our city, not the federal government, as a symbol of American democracy and American ingenuity. And that's why I'm so very proud today to release our first ever resiliency strategy. It is the result of a nearly 2-year process of shared discovery and understanding, with over 1,000 residents having participated in the development of the strategy. And to develop Resilient DC, we took a hard look at both potential sudden shocks, including severe weather, cyber attacks, and government shutdowns, alongside chronic stresses that you heard Clarence talk about, that cities like ours are dealing with each and every day, including the high cost of housing, the challenges of poverty that challenge cities like ours on a daily basis. So we certainly need to be resilient to climate change because in the district, scientists predict that the number of heat emergencies that we will experience will double by the year 2050. We also need to be resilient to 21st century challenges, including cybercrime. Last year, as an example, we saw over 330,000 attempted cyber attacks against our network in a 4-day period. We're resilient, though, so we were able to deal with them. But we know cyber crooks get smarter, and they, too, are resilient. So how we build stronger and harden our systems is important to how our city survives. And building a resilient DC is also about addressing major changes alongside our everyday challenges. The cost of housing being one, as a challenge that we're dealing with head on in our city. This year alone, we have a increased budget in front of the Council of the District of Columbia that builds on my commitment to build and preserve affordable housing in the district, including a new challenge to our city to build 36,000 new units by 2025. Because DC is growing, we are, in fact, expecting 1 million new residents by the year 2045. Now, every city wants to grow. Clarence will tell you. When you're the mayor of the city that's losing population, you have a whole nother set of issues to deal with. I'm a mayor that has been leading a city for the last 4.5 years, and some years before that, that's growing and growing fast. And the challenges of growth have been immense. And we're proud to say that this document deals head on with how growth has created more inequality and how we can focus on dealing with issues like affordable housing and making sure that our residents have access to quality education and good job opportunities to continue to live in the district. The district's strategy also confronts a new unique challenge that we have in our city, and that is we are the seat of our federal government, and we're proud of that. We're proud to be our capital city. We are proud to welcome over 20 million visitors from our nation and around the world each and every year. We're also proud that we have safe and respectful ways for people from around our nation to come and deal with the federal government and address their grievances through demonstrations and protests. But all of those things are unique in our city. We also have, unfortunately, we have a greater threat when we think of terrorist activity. And finally, one completely man-made threat that we can deal with also at the ballot box is government shutdown. And that we know specifically, we can put a dollar amount on it this year. The shutdown that we had this year, unprecedented in length, cost the city $47 million. Those monies could have been invested in this strategy, closing inequality, hardening our systems against the threats that we have already mentioned. We recognize that the federal government's outsized presence in our city, but we also have been making tremendous strides in promoting our private sector economy and making our economy more resilient against these changes. That's why the strategy also focuses on ways we can leverage our economic prosperity to address longstanding inequities. We can start our resilient strategy right now by making bold investments. We know, for example, as a city that's growing, but our geography doesn't grow, we have to make the best of the infrastructure that we have. We need to make transportation cheaper, faster, more convenient, and more people-centered while reducing pollution. So in this budget, I have allocated $122 million to rebuild K Street, a transit way that creates dedicated bike and bus lanes to move traffic more quickly through downtown DC. Now, $122 million in capital investment is big, and it represents trade-offs. And for some people, those trade-offs could be really tough. And so that's why we are asking the council to be bold with us and to make sure that we can create an example on K Street that may serve other corridors in the district that will promote bus and biking and alternatives to single occupant vehicle travel in the city. So for the next project, it will be even easier to get done. I have also increased our investment, as I mentioned, into the Housing Production Trust Fund. When I became mayor, we were investing in the city, and former council member Wells will remember, we thought it was a big number then, $50 million a year in the Housing Production Trust Fund. We've doubled that amount every year I've been mayor. And this year, we're asking the council to take a bold step with us, to take our investment from $100 million a year to $130 million a year, and also create a new tool. A tool for the working people in our city that have good jobs, but they still can't find housing in our city. The social worker, the firefighter, the police officer. This new workforce housing fund will help us with our resilience as well. Because can you imagine a city where only the rich could live and only the very poor could find subsidized housing? What about the people in the middle? What about families? So that's why we're also focused on this new tool. Our resilience strategy aligns the district's major planning efforts into one coordinated strategy. Kevin briefed me throughout this period, and he had lined up all of the different plans that we had and the major promises. Sometimes we call them initiatives or policies, but really what they are promises. And what each of those plans laid out, there's a lot of synergy, as you might imagine. One director told me that participating on the Resilience Cabinet was one of the most impactful experiences that she'd had in planning in district government, because all of those different promises were brought together. And our hope is that we are able to streamline them, not only in one document, but in a system of accountability as we implement the plan. And so we all know that we have the responsibility to think ahead, to plan for the future, and to lead. We want our city to continue to be a model for the rest of the nation. And by examining our challenges and vulnerabilities, we will not only build a more resilient DC, but also create opportunity for DC residents to ensure that every family has an opportunity, every person has an opportunity to participate in the prosperity we are creating. So congratulations to everyone. Thank you for what you are doing with us today, and we look forward to sharing the details of our resilient DC strategy. Thank you. So let me introduce Michael Berkowitz from 100 Resilient Cities. We love it when organizations want to support cities like ours with staff and resources and know-how, and that's exactly what 100 Resilient Cities has been able to do for us. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor. Thanks. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Clarence Anthony, and the entire National League of Cities for hosting us. It's really a fantastic venue and an organization with whom's work we are really well aligned. So thank you again. Thanks, Mayor, Rashad Young, Kevin Bush, the entire Resilient DC team. We have just been absolutely delighted, privileged, honored to work with you and partner with you on this strategy. It's been just a delight. To see how the city is able to leverage its expertise, and we're able to leverage what the network is able to bring to really drive this to a place that goes beyond where you were before, and we're quite proud of that. Mayor, I pick up on your reference. We met. We had 1,000 applicants for the 100 cities. So it was really quite a competitive selection process. And what we learned is that as we got to semifinalists, that was the time to talk to the mayor and the senior leadership team to see if they were really committed. And that's the video conference we had. It was 2016, just the end of our selecting the third cohort. And we were going to select about 30 cities. We had almost 300 applicants for that round. And really, we were looking for progressive leaders that understood that their problems and their opportunities were interconnected in a way, and that wanted to move beyond that. They didn't have to have all the answers. In fact, cities that have all the answers are not, from our perspective, they're not fun to work with. It's the cities that are still into exploring what those opportunities are, and that's what we found when we had that video conference. We saw an influential city, one that would both learn from and teach the network, and one that really understood that these problems were interrelated in a way that was meaningful to work on them together and not just in silos, one next to the other. And I want to pick up on something that Clarence Anthony said about resilience being more than just more than just about climate, more than just about infrastructure. It is fitting, and I hadn't thought of it before, that the first chapter in this strategy is about inclusion, because in many ways that's the X factor. Cities rarely know what the next thing is that's going to happen to them. So designing specific solutions just for those individual threats has a sort of diminishing returns. But building strong community cohesion, inclusivity, equitability, that makes cities stronger and ultimately more resilient, whatever the next challenge is. And you can approach it in different ways. I mean, you can also say, that it's the right thing, that it's the just thing, that it's the moral thing. Those are all really important entry points. But for us, it's a way to address fragility and build resilience by building more cohesive, equitable communities. And so that's why one of the reasons I'm so proud of this, and that's why your remarks are just resonated with me so much. I think, I'll just give you a couple, and then Kevin Bush will come up, but I'll just give you a couple of quick points about why I like this work. One is that we see cities all over the world, not just cities, Mayor, you said cities like ours. I would say there isn't a city in the world that's not struggling with climate challenges, equity challenges, and the changing nature of work. And you see this strategy trying to integrate and tackle all three of those together. That's really the opportunity. The money you spent on climate solutions should necessarily also drive equitable solutions and vice versa. That's the magic of seeing these things together. So that's one reason I like it. Second is, it's this balance between big projects, ambitious projects, long-term projects, and small, what can we get done this year, what can we get done in my term kind of projects. The arc of a city will happen, started before you took the mayor's office, and will continue after. And so having some ambitious projects like the river project, like the transition of work stuff, that's really important. And yet, We know we need to get things done this year, and so I like there's projects in there, like building new 3D flood models, like reminding landlords that they can increasingly diversify their own plots of land. Those are things we can get done this year. We can check off, and when you do your next State of the City, those will be things that we've gotten done. So this balance between tactical stuff we can get done this year, you can get done this year, and long-term stuff that will strategically, fundamentally reshape the district into a more equitable, cohesive, and resilient place. Those are the kinds of strategies we like. So I like the balance of that in this strategy. And third is, and this is probably just selfish, I like that this strategy draws inspiration from other cities in the network. So the Economic Mobility Lab drew inspiration, I know, from Boston. There's a bunch of green infrastructure work that drew inspiration from New York City and from New Orleans. Like, I like seeing this as both learning from the network, and ultimately I'm quite sure that this work here, including the strategy, will teach the network. So that's really why I like this strategy. And I'll just wrap up and say, I often have this Churchill quote running through my head at strategy releases, which is, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, perhaps it's the end of the beginning, and that's really what this represents, right? Cities do good strategies. That's not particularly innovative. They do integrated strategies. That's not integrated. That's not innovative. But to actually execute and implement on it, as Mayor, you mentioned, that's going to be the thing that moves the needle for the residents of DC and this region and ultimately the nation. So hopefully we can, this collective network of people here, of our network, our partners, we can be partners to you throughout implementation, because that's what we want to see. We want to see the innovative things outlined in this strategy actually come to fruition and change the path, the direction for this city for the good in the long term. So with that, let me stop. And where's Kevin? Invite Kevin to come up and give us a little brief on the strategy. Thank you very much.
All right. Good morning, everybody. So I have the fun job of telling you at a very high level what this 180-page document is all about. Before I do that, though, I want to make sure that you know that there are, oh, wow, you took them all already. This is great. There were copies over there. If you didn't get one, they're up on resilient.dc.gov. So I find that when talking about resilience and what we've done together, it often is important to start off with a definition of resilience. So let's do that. Any city's ability to function is entirely dependent on two concepts that I'd like to introduce today. How well we deal with both the acute shocks and the chronic stresses. So these acute shocks, these are the things that you might think of in the traditional emergency management context, something like a derecho maybe, or maybe even a government shutdown like the mayor mentioned. And our ability to thrive in the face of those big shocks is entirely dependent on how well we deal with the chronic stresses. These are the everyday, ongoing challenges that if we don't address in a systematic way, will be laid bare when one of those acute shocks comes knocking. And so that's the technical definition of urban resilience up there on the screen. But really what I'm talking about here is the immune system of the city, making sure that we're as healthy and thriving a city as possible, so that when inevitably something comes along the way, we're better prepared for it. So what did we do? How did we do to get here? I see an awful lot of familiar faces in the room, so I know that many of you are very familiar with this process because you were part of it. And I want to thank you for being here today and for being here in the year and a half beforehand to get us to this point. So as the mayor and Michael mentioned, we started this journey together in 2016 when we beat out, just to remind everybody, 1,000 other cities worldwide to be part of this network. And then we launched the process to start a resilience strategy in earnest in January. And let's take that immune system metaphor a little bit further. We started by saying, where is our immune system healthy and where is it strong? And so we went to the doctor and we got a physical. We read all of these plans that we've already created that the mayor mentioned. We cataloged over 900 different actions and 160 high-level goals. I came knocking on many of your doors for the first time to get a sense of where you thought our immune system was weak and where you thought it was strong. We also talked to the folks over at the Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency and said, well, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? What do you think we need to be planning for? And we used that process to diagnose additional tests, to come up with a couple big, bold questions about the future of DC. And then in May, we organized around those questions. We formed working groups that many of you were on, and again, thank you for your work, that involved both district government staff and leaders from the community to work together. I was amazed by the amount of work that you all agreed to do for free. Thank you. We had folks do best practice research, literature reviews. We even had some folks bike up and down the Anacostia River and map public access points. We then pulled everybody back together and said, what did you learn? Where is our immune system weak? Where is it strong? Where are the opportunities to build resilience together? We took all of those ideas and we went out to the community for what we kind of jokingly referred to as the month of engagement in November. It was a busy month. We met with 11 different stakeholder groups, everybody from the business improvement districts to the family strengthening collaboratives. We took every idea that came out of one of those stakeholder meetings and we put it up online to be as transparent as possible. People could go online and vote ideas up. They could vote them down. They could say, did you think about this work, or did you think about that thing? And then we went into all 8 wards and held open houses. It wasn't a formal presentation like this. We just had data up on the screens and we engaged folks in a conversation. Every idea that came out of that one of those open houses, we also put up online. And at the end of the day, when you took every single idea that came out of that process and all of the ideas that had come out of the prior planning work that DC's done, we had this really big, kind of ugly spreadsheet. But what it represented was a tremendous amount of opportunity to work together to make sure that we're prioritizing resources and build resilience. And all of those ideas then became Resilient DC and the strategy that you have in front of you today. So a little bit about the strategy. The strategy outlines a set of goals and initiatives and objectives to get us there. So there's 4 goals within the strategy that set generational ambition to thrive in the face of change. As Michael mentioned, it's not just things we can do today, but goalposts for us off into the future. There's 16 objectives that outline the work that's necessary to meet those goals, and then 68 initiatives that are specific, coordinated efforts and commitments to adapt to and leverage change. We also identified 2 focus areas that are right up in the front of the strategy that are either flagship initiatives to showcase resilience or address issues that are fundamental to building resilience. And I just have to say, too, that although there are 60 initiatives, this is really about setting a bold vision for the future and coming up with new ways. So if you're flipping through the strategy and you're saying, oh, well, you didn't think about that, that could really get us there, by all means, let us know. I think what we've done here is put a stake in the ground and say, here's the future that we need to be building, because this is what we're building toward. And a little bit, I've mentioned the focus areas before, but to dive in deep to them, we have one focus area that came out of our Anacostia working group, because as we were doing this process, it was also the year of the Anacostia, and there were a number of milestones that we're celebrating together. We also have a focus area that's about equity in governance and making sure that as we're going out into the community, that we're tracking our commitments and making sure that we're implementing them. And then our first goal on inclusive growth envisions a DC where all residents benefit from our continued economic and population growth, because as the mayor mentioned, we're 700,000 people now. We're going to get to 1 million by 2045, and we already have a housing gap that makes it hard to afford rent for many folks in the district. And at the same time, though, we're investing more per capita than really any other city in the country to produce more units and preserve units of existing affordable housing. So we've got a vision that focuses on that commitment to produce 36,000 units and to work across the region and make sure that they're doing their part to increase the housing supply as well. We also have a number of initiatives that are focused on making transportation cheaper, faster, and more convenient, and on efforts to diversify our economy to make sure that we're set up for the next time there's a government shutdown, hopefully not anytime soon. Our next goal focuses on climate action. I don't know that I have to remind most folks in the room here, but Washington, D.C. is a delta city. Both of our rivers are tidal, and we're experiencing some of the fastest rate of sea level rise along the East Coast. It's also a very hot city in the summer, and it's going to get hotter. And we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to really institutionalize climate action throughout all of our work. So we have an initiative to create a digital twin of DC. This is one of my favorite. I'll admit that it's a little bit dorky. But this would create a 3D model of the district that shows how water is going to interact and move throughout the city in the future to better understand where we need to be investing now in infrastructure and to address that flood risk, because it's not all just about the communities along the river. If a derecho comes through, that floods neighborhoods' basements that are far from the river. We also have a goal focused on adapting to and leveraging different types of technological change. So there's 3 big components here that we're planning for. The first is the impact of workforce automation on DC workers. The second is the changing way that people and goods move throughout the city and what that means for how we design and plan for transportation. And then the third, as the mayor mentioned in her remarks, is as we become increasingly reliant on Internet of Things, on connected devices to do things more effectively and efficiently, we also have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to steel ourselves against those cyber threats when they do come our way. The fourth goal is, unlike the first 3, which are focused on individual types of change that we need to be resilient to, the fourth goal recognizes that we also have to address individual and personal resilience to make sure that no matter what type of shock comes your way, that you, yourself, and your community are resilient to it. And that's focused on making sure that we're reducing crime in all 8 wards and addressing some of the persistent and longstanding racial and geographic disparities in health outcomes. So that's a quick overview of the strategy. I don't think we would have gotten here today without really the work that you all did together in working with me. At the end of the day, the Resilient DC team is 3 people in the Wilson building, with the support of the mayor and the resilience cabinet that she, I think, very strategically set up before this work even began. And then I think we're going to need your help to make sure that every single one of these initiatives, all 68 initiatives and both those focus areas in the front of the strategy, that we're firing on all cylinders to make sure that we deliver on those. So again, I want to thank the Resilience Cabinet, the mayor and the city administrator for their leadership, and then the team at 100 Resilient Cities, who deliver just an absolutely tremendous amount of work and partnership and thought leadership to get us here. And then, of course, the Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. I know there's a number of members here, and they were very involved in setting the vision and the direction for the strategy. So enough about the Chief Resilience Officer talking about what's in the resilience strategy. That's boring. You could probably just look at the strategy yourself. Let's hear what some other folks have to say about the strategy. So I want to invite up our panel, if you guys all want to come and sit up right here, excuse me. We put together a panel of folks that are both thought leaders locally and nationally on many of these issues to see what they thought about the strategy. So up here on the stage, working from left to right, we have Dr. Brandy Gilbert, who's a research associate at the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where her research primarily focuses on disaster resilience. And she's looked at those issues that connect social and economic resilience with big disasters when they come their way. Then we have Marian Mulligan McFadden, who serves as Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Senior Advisor for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners. Previously, she was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Next up, we have Kathleen Kelly, who's a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where her work focuses on international and U.S. climate mitigation, preparedness, resilience, and sustainable development policy. And last but not least, our moderator, Christina Sturtevant-Sani, who's a freelance writer and proud DC native. Her work has appeared on City Lab, Greater Washington, Afro, East of the River Magazine, and Elevation DC. She was also recently a Urban Resilience Journalism Fellow at Greater Washington, where she explored how some of these issues come together. So, take it away.
Okay. Thank you all for being here. So I have a few opening questions for each of you based on your expertise, and you have about 5 minutes to answer those, and I have some follow-ups, and then I want to open it up to the audience. Is that okay? Okay, cool. So, as previously stated, the first goal in the plan is to ensure that the city grows inclusively. And so it talks about how DC has experienced economic boom over the years, but that growth has not benefited residents equally, in part due to the country's legacy of structural racism. And so, Kathleen, based on your expertise, can you walk us through some of the historical inequities that have made certain individuals more vulnerable to the shocks and the stresses addressed in the report? And then tell us your reaction to the plan's approach to dismantling some of those injustices. No pressure.
Thank you, Christina. And I want to thank Kevin Bush for inviting me to be here, and Mayor Bowser, congratulations on this excellent plan. This is really groundbreaking, and it's just a thrill to be here with you today to celebrate the launch of this plan, so thank you. Well, let me say a few words about climate change and how that relates to historic inequities, because I do work on climate change, so I would feel remiss not to talk a bit about that. But we all know well that the impacts of climate change are not a distant threat. We are already experiencing the impacts of climate change, not only here in Washington, D.C., but in cities across the nation. The district, for example, is already experiencing more powerful storms, heavier rainfall, more intense and frequent heat events, sea level rise, and other impacts that create hardships for district residents, particularly for families who are struggling to make ends meet. We are just a few months now into 2019, and we've already experienced in the United States 1 billion or more extreme weather disasters. And in 2018, we experienced 14 disasters that cost the nation more than $1 billion. And there is an overwhelming volume of scientific evidence and data that show that this is not just a coincidence. This is part of a long-term and alarming trend of more extreme, damaging, and deadly extreme weather events that are fueled by climate change. And with each event, we really learn the same lesson over and over again, and that is that low-income communities and communities of color are the most vulnerable to more extreme weather in a changing climate. These communities have the fewest resources to prepare for and recover from more extreme weather, and they are often located in the most flood-prone areas or in heat islands that absorb heat through concrete and asphalt and then radiate that heat back into the community and create extreme health risks, especially when we're experiencing higher heat and more extreme weather and more heat waves. This is all part of a legacy of discriminatory housing and infrastructure policies that have pushed people of color and low-income people to live in the most undesirable areas of our cities, with exposure to unsafe infrastructure and cut off from economic opportunities. Low-income communities and communities of color are often overburdened by disproportionately high air pollution and water pollution. And this is a legacy of environmental racism in our nation that has led to a concentration of industrial facilities and other sources of pollution in these communities. And together, these unjust policies have created high barriers to economic opportunities, including quality schools, healthcare, affordable housing. And they have helped to perpetuate the racial wealth gap that despite recent economic booms. And for all these reasons, climate change action plans and city resilience strategies can no longer focus only on curbing carbon pollution and building resilience to the impacts. And for somebody who has worked in the climate change field for over 2 decades, sadly, that has been the focus of environmentalists, is simply on the environmental impacts of climate change. And finally, we're seeing through groundbreaking plans like Resilient DC, this is shifting, and that is a huge historic breakthrough. And I think Clarence and Michael shared this well during their opening remarks. We can't just focus on climate change and the impacts when we're looking at solutions. we also must center our policies, our plans, and strategies on tackling historic inequity and racial injustice. We need to focus on building safer, stronger, and more resilient communities and creating a more inclusive economy while we shift away from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. The good news is that Mayor Bowser's plan tackles all of these things, which is fantastic. Resilient DC takes critical steps to incorporate climate change projections into land use, into building codes, into infrastructure, into parks, and other capital investments so that they are built to last in a changing climate. And to cut pollution, as Kevin laid out, the plan sets an ambitious goal to be carbon neutral by 2050 and also sets an ambitious 20% energy efficiency target for DC government buildings, among many other steps. And on top of those climate goals, the Resilient DC plan also addresses other critical challenges that the city is facing, including affordable housing, economic and social inequity, public health, and urban mobility. This is groundbreaking and truly historic, and it's just an honor to be here as this plan is launched. Of course, no plan is a success until it is actually implemented, and I think that that's going to be the challenge going forward, to go beyond just lip service and to make real progress to tackle these pressing challenges. The mayor and her team will need to not only implement the plan, but make sure that they can secure adequate resources to implement the plan in an effective and comprehensive way to really make substantial progress. And by implementing the plan, Mayor Bowser and her team can really model, as she said she intends to do for other cities, how to design and make a reality equitable and innovative strategies to tackle historic inequities and climate change together. And now more than ever, we need this leadership as the Trump administration is on a warpath to dismantle critical environmental and public health protections. We need that forward-thinking leadership from mayors like Mayor Bowser to take action and really make sure that we are tackling historic inequities and climate change together. The reality is we're really running out of time when it comes to climate change. So we need action from all levels of government, local, state, regional, as well as federal government to tackle this challenge. I will leave it at that, and thank you again, Mayor Bowser and Kevin, for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Kathleen. So according to the report, the region will face a shortfall of 690,000 housing units by 2045, which is 20% more units than the 575,000 currently needed to close the housing gap. So Marion, how well do you believe the plan addresses DC's affordable housing crisis and the threat of displacement for some residents?
Great question, thank you. And can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. And I join Kathleen in congratulating the mayor and the Resilience Council and Kevin and the team that worked on this report, because I think it addresses the affordable housing shortage in the district very well. To amplify something that was said earlier, you have some of the best affordable housing policy in the nation. If you are not first, you are tied for first with other high-cost cities that are doing everything across the board that can be done, from production to preservation, tenants' rights, to ensure that you are making real progress on the terrible shortage of affordable housing. And I think that that's an incredible credit to the mayor, to Director Donaldson, and others across the council and across the city who are seeing this as not a discrete problem, but an integral problem to the inclusive growth of the city. If there's anyone here who's new to this resilience work, who's kind of scratching your head saying, what does affordable housing have to do with resilience? I will say I was with you when I came to this work. In the beginning of working with 100 Resilient Cities back in about 2013, I really thought, oh, that means they're going to get some engineers together to write some plans, and then they'll go out and kind of bounce them off the public and let the public weigh in and say, oh, no, you're protecting the wrong building from flooding. I really didn't get it, and I didn't understand until I started working with 100 resilient cities and hearing from the cities that were engaging in the process what it was really going to take to make them strong and able to bounce back or bounce forward, as people like to say, after major events happened. This is not a process about Mother Nature. It's a process about thinking about the people in the city and how to take all those discrete plans and put them together and to go forward. So, how resilient you're able to be on any given day starts with where you wake up in the morning, whether you had a good night's sleep, whether you felt safe in your bed, whether you had a bed at all, whether you were breathing in mold or other challenges. You need to have the basics to go ahead and productively contribute to the city and to bring your best self forward. And I'm so impressed with the commitment of the Bowser administration to do that. I can talk some more a little bit later about the specifics in the plan, but that focus on ensuring that dollars are available to government dollars are coming in to leverage the private sector funds to produce and preserve units is really commendable. And particularly that commitment to preserving 100% of the existing affordable housing units. I think it's as if DC took the approach that doctors are supposed to take of first do no harm.
So, Brandy, many of the issues in the report are not unique to DC. So what do you think other cities can learn from DC's strategies?
Probably talking about how other cities can learn from DC and also how cities can learn from each other. I'm Brandy Gilbert, and I'm from the Urban Institute, and we have been serving as the evaluation team for the 100RC initiative and looking at DC's work as well as across other cities. And so we recently published a report with some preliminary results from that work, so I'll also be speaking a bit more broadly to some of those high-level findings. And so 3 key takeaways that I see are, one, that developing a resilient strategy is really a journey. The second one is that the journey must be collaborative. And the third is that sustainability is key because the road is long and it's really wide, as you can see from the many issues that this strategy tackled. So first, that developing a resilient strategy is really a process. And so one of the findings that the report speaks to is that of all the cities who have been a part of 100 resilient cities, none of the cities have had the same set of shocks and stresses in the application period as it did with the strategy release, which shows that there is work to be done, that a city has already done tons of work, as Kevin mentioned, to beat out 1,000 other cities. You have to do some work, right? But still, that there's more work to do to really figure out what are those shocks and stresses, how do you refine them, and about using data and using evidence and using lots of voices to bring together, which includes lots of you in the room. And also taking stock of existing plans. And so one of the things that the strategy dives into is 11 of the current cities' plans that they have taken stock of and figured out how to move those forward and how to be more integrated in those plans. And there are many more plans in the city as well that talk through and mention issues around resilience. So that process is really just as important as the product. And one thing that we haven't talked about is that a city doesn't have to be developing a resilience strategy to learn from this work, to learn from 100RC and to learn from all the things that DC has been doing. Cities are transforming themselves and doing planning every day. So this work can be a model for all cities regardless of where they are in their planning or if they're part of a formal cohort of cities like DC is. The second is that the journey must be collaborative. So cross-sector work has played a key role for all of the strategies that have been developed, including the DC strategy. And it's really about changing the way that cities work, traditionally in a really siloed way, with lots of departments doing their mission because their own mission is so big, but really pushing past that and bringing those agencies together to work in a more integrated way. And for 100 resilient cities, for this strategy, DC has really done that, and the strategy speaks to some of those ways. And so some of that cities can see is building on existing places for that and just taking account of those groups, and others is forming new spaces to bring together leaders. And so for DC in particular, it's also looking at across the phase of this work with strategy development, what that collaboration might look like. So in the early phases, bringing together individuals, having workshops, including residents, government, private sector, nonprofit, just really hitting every sector. Also, when the city was in the trenches of strategy development, creating new groups like the Resilience Cabinet, like the Commission on Climate Change, and then toward the latter part, really having that resident engagement especially. And so having the Neighborland portal where the city brought in engagement from 1,000 residents and posting all those ideas and having that live system of ranking and giving feedback. And lastly, that sustainability is key. DC is part of a growing initiative of 100 resilient cities, and so far since the fall, those cities in total had 147 initiatives that were on the ground and underway. Lots of them around advocacy campaigns and also around infrastructure developments. And so it's in a group of peers that are moving and thriving. And DC is also already thriving on some of its initiatives even before the formal strategy launches because it's building on existing work. Another piece that makes how the DC strategy is working to be more sustainable is having a structure for management and for implementation. So the strategy really speaks to having a person who's in charge of it and who's reporting directly to DC, the city administration, as well as having direct buy-in from the Resilience Cabinet and other key groups, so already having somewhere to plug into for that implementation. And lastly, I really appreciated the remarks from the mayor in discussing the budgetary commitment, because those pieces for sustainability are not possible without the funds in place. And so she really spoke to some of the pieces that are already there as far as budget commitments. And the strategy also notes that there are checks and balances around the budget. And so, for example, having annual budget review processes that specifically focus on resilience and drive towards the initiative. So that sustainability piece is really key.
So when you all looked at the report, were there any shocks and stresses that you thought could have been tackled more aggressively, or were there any issues in DC that weren't mentioned at all that you thought could have been addressed?
I was really stunned when I read the plan, 180 pages, was it? How comprehensive it is. I mean, I really looked because I knew you were going to ask us this question. What's missing? And I kept, something's. Oh, they didn't tackle displacement and affordable. Oh, wait, no, there's a whole, meaty chapter on that here. And so I think what struck me was really that there really wasn't much missing at all. I think, as I said in my opening remarks, the challenge for the city is it is so comprehensive, and I think it really has a lot of creativity around leveraging existing programs and initiatives and scaling those up where they've been successful to really focus on implementing the strategy in its entirety, and to do that keeping equity and racial justice as the core goals, because when resources get tight, often I think those goals get sidelined. So I think keeping equity and justice as the centerpiece of the plan and securing the resources that are really going to be needed to implement the plan at the scale that's envisioned are going to be the real challenges for DC.
I would say two things are missing. The first being brevity. And the second, but that's okay because it's so comprehensive. I don't mean that critically. And then the second thing is simply that there was actually more opportunity to talk about some of the great things that the city's doing, and some of those were left out. So one of the things that came to mind is the great housing code enforcement that's going on, and that's a credit to the mayor and the attorney general, and really going after the high-profile owners of decrepit, dangerous housing, and making sure that they get rid of their properties or otherwise get the properties up to code. So I guess that's by way of saying, no, I don't think there's anything really critical missing, which is just a real credit to the communal work that was done and the continuous feedback loop set up with the community.
There were lots of beautiful charts and data visualizations, but one chart that I imagined that was missing was just a few more pages, not too many more, just a few more, that had all of the DC existing plans that the strategy is saying it's mapping itself onto or integrating with, and the initiatives side by side. And for each initiative, it would note where there are direct ties back to the plans. And some of that was in the text. Noting where there are connections to the plans, but really explicitly for every plan that the city is saying that it's integrating with, what is the initiative that goes along with that?
So, as a local reporter, sometimes I feel like I'm bombarded with like press releases of initiatives and like plans and reports and promises, as the mayor said. And then we have these events like this one. And then I talk to residents, and then they talk about how they know about these plans, but then a month or a year, years later, like nothing really comes of it. So, what advice do you have for DC residents to make sure that we hold the authors of the report accountable?
Great question. Well, there's a lot in the plan to monitor. So I think the first step is for DC residents to really internalize the plan and get familiar with these bold initiatives that are in there. But I think for residents who are willing to engage and educate themselves on the key pillars of the plan, I think really monitoring the key government agencies with the responsibility of implementing these plans and making sure to be vocal in a very public way when they're falling short. And they can do that at public meetings or through social media, talking to reporters like you. It's always a great strategy, and mobilizing others in the community to become aware and to really hold the mayor's feet to the fire, and Kevin and the administration to actually make good on the promises that are made in the plan.
I agree. I think following the money is the most important thing. So as you're hearing about major expenditures of the government, as you're reviewing the mayor's proposed budget and what passes out of council, as you look at the consolidated plan process for the use of CDBG funds, for example, ask yourself, are we making progress on those commitments? As ballot initiatives are coming up, ask and keep asking your government officials, is this consistent with the plan?
Christina, and I would actually flip the question to what should plan implementers do to keep residents engaged, and say that it's not only the job of the residents, as you and we all know, to be engaged in holding those feet to the fire, but it's also those plan implementers who said engagement was so important in building the plan, but continuing that commitment to engaging residents around challenges and kind of what's working well and driving those funds as the plan moves forward.
Do you have any questions from the audience, perhaps? Right, okay. I don't know.
Good afternoon. I'm Jason Turner, and I serve on the Mayor's Commission on Climate Change and Resiliency. Really appreciate this conversation, everyone's engagement. One of the things that we are very keen on with the Commission is, again, this notion of how we engage residents. And of course, we many times hear many times we get very positive engagement and active engagement from many communities within the city. But we also are very keen to discuss where we're not getting the engagement, that we'd really like to have. And of course, we are also sensitive to the fact that a lot of the real challenges from a health care perspective and from an equity perspective are experienced by some of our poorest residents. So that said, specifically, are there, what other, and I would also ask this to our friends at the National League of Cities, are there some other specific programs of outreach in some of these, the poorest and hardest to engage communities that our commission and that the city can replicate? Again, a lot of times we talk about the need to have this, we talk about the lack of equity, but then when we look around at the room here today, I would argue that there are probably very few residents that we are talking about that need to be engaged that are at this launch. So again, I think we all understand the question and challenges. I'm asking how can we be informed specifically in Dallas and Portland and some of the other areas of 100 Resilient Cities or in the NLC of specific strategies and tactics where this engagement has increased. Thank you.
Start, and then you guys. So thank you. Great question. So 2 years ago, I worked with an environmental justice leader, Dr. Cecilia Martinez, to write a report for mayors. It was a framework for local action offering 9 strategies for mayors to build just and resilient cities. And we looked at case studies across the country of what cities like DC and others are doing to curb emissions and address the impacts of climate change. And we looked particularly at how cities can effectively engage community members, including in low-income areas and communities of color. And a couple of examples come to mind, actually, in Baltimore. The resilience officer, the sustainability officer, she felt like just convening a meeting at City Hall or at some of the other public event spaces that the city owned was just not going to be adequate. So she went into communities, and she did a lot of one-on-ones, a lot of just small group meetings, going to churches, going to community centers, to really meet people where they were at, to hear their voices, and also to educate them on the risks of climate change and get their input on various strategies. Seattle actually had a fantastic public engagement strategy as well, working very closely with community leaders and community-based organizations to make sure that the outreach and engagement was inclusive and effective. And we're working with partners in Miami that are doing a lot to engage residents in Little Haiti and Little Havana and other areas that are very vulnerable to more extreme weather and heat waves and other impacts. And they are also going into communities, and to get people to the table, they're paying for transportation, they're hosting childcare so that families can bring their kids, and providing food and music and other things just to get people to the table, and then having a substantive agenda as well. Those are just a few thoughts that come to mind.
I was going to add about the piece around paying residents for engagement, and some people think that that's an ethical challenge, but it's really not, especially if the payment is addressing barriers like transportation, helping to pay for childcare, those kinds of things. Part of our evaluation team is here on the front row, and we also work on another study around community engagement. And one of our partners was telling us, who's working in New Orleans, that paying people has really been helping them and is really changing the game for them. And so what they do is they have literally a pile of cash, and they say, if anybody needs it, take a 20 from the table or take what you need. But if not, we're going to save it for the next group. And so people can use it in that way. People don't feel like, oh, it's taking a payment or not taking a payment. It's a choice, for one. And also they know that if they don't take it, if they didn't really need it, you might get it, and you might need it, or you might need it, or I might need it next time. And so that kind of changes the framework for that you pay and how you pay.
I'll throw in a couple of what not to do's. A few years ago, I was working with the federal government with Kevin Bush on Hurricane Sandy recovery, and we worked closely with 100 Resilient Cities founder, the Rockefeller Foundation, on community engagement around large infrastructure projects in communities. And we quickly learned the dangers of overpromising in communities, or being unclear about what was, hey, let's dream about what we want, and here's the amount of money we're committing to something, now let's shape it. So coming to communities with that real clarity around what is committed versus what may come in the future, so that people don't feel frustrated. That work that we did was in the context of competition, where some communities were winners and some communities were, non-winners at the end of the day when the funding was doled out. Something else I would say is, which the district folks already know, maybe don't bring the 188-page report in a long deck in doing the engagement with community members who don't have the time or possibly the literacy to deal with that. Just focus on the important issues and take it from there.
Thank you.
I'm Juan de Clet Barreto with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Last year, with the leadership of Kate Johnson and Dr. Natasha Ulugama from the Thriving Earth Exchange, we developed a policy brief on urban heat islands and mapped out vulnerable populations following the the DC Climate Ready Adaptation Plan. How can scientists such as myself continue to get involved after the release of this report, and making sure that expertise such as ours can provide useful feedback for what's in the future for this plan?
I'll go first and say I think the Union of Concerned Scientists is doing exactly what you should be doing. Holding science up, and at a time when science is under attack, and explaining at the community level what it could mean. So whether it's heat concerns, flooding concerns, you've done a great job of helping the average person see what the future is going to look like. So I think continuing that national leadership and then focusing on the major initiatives at the community level, you guys are killing it. So thank you and congratulations.
I'll just agree with Marion and say, you know, I read the Union of Concerned Scientists reports all the time, and the way you're able to take scientific information and translate it into a way that is just easily understandable for people and how it affects their daily lives is just incredibly valuable. And getting that information, you know, out in front of media and others, I think just helps to make the challenges we're facing that much more real and relevant to people's everyday lives. So I think more of that is on point.
Along with others, I just wanted to congratulate the mayor's office and everybody involved for this document. I think there was a question of what may be missing from the document. I'm no expert on any of these topics, but it would seem like one topic that jumps to mind is really creating resources for people to have childcare that live in the city, and that being an aspect, because that's an aspect that's having people move out of the city because it's expensive to pay for a child here. So would love feedback on that. And also another aspect that it seemed a bit missing in terms of looking at how to support students, and specifically students and training students from DC about being part of the future technological industry that's going to be here in DC. So I would love some specifics on that as well. And wondered if I heard mention of the Equity Advisory Council that was kind of part of this process, and how that equity work is being handled, or training and development of equity work is being handled on the agency level, making sure that the people that are developing these plans are actually speaking the same language.
Sure, there was a lot there. So I'll take some pieces of that, and that I agree that those could be some helpful additions, and it seems like there were some pieces of that even around the initiatives around education. So for example, helping to increase college graduation rates, I could see as an avenue to also intermingling with those other initiatives around technological advances, and definitely childcare seems like it could be a good addition.
The district is fairly unique in having universal pre-K 3 and 4, which is fantastic, and I think we've seen great results in communities in the way that children are progressing in their kindergarten readiness. So I absolutely agree that more investment, both before the age of 3 and after kindergarten, for some more aftercare availability is a great suggestion.
I agree with those points, so don't have much to add.
I would defer the questions about the training at the agency level back to Kevin or others who worked on the plan.
Any more questions? Oh, one more question.
Educator, so I have a teacher's voice. Okay. Good morning. My name is Gloria Mobley, and I am the Director of Experiential Learning at the Whittle School and Studios. And I am thrilled because one of the reasons for me attending this was to see how we could encourage our young people to really start to become advocates and make sure that they're a part of the solution and going out and talking to their contemporaries. So my congratulations to the mayor and her staff. This is a phenomenal endeavor. With that said, I'd like to know, where were the children's voices? When I read this, it seems like it's all about adults. Now, I haven't finished all of it, but where are the children's voices? And at what point do we begin to work with them? Thank you.
Can't speak to how children were engaged in the development of this plan, but I will just say I agree with you 100%. We need to engage young people in the conversation about not only climate change and how to reduce emissions and build more resilience, but also to tackle historic racial injustice and build a more inclusive economy. I think we've seen, starting this fall with the Green New Deal and just the vocal and vibrant youth movement that is occurring around climate change that is just shifted the conversation and elevated the issue in Congress in a way that we just haven't seen. And so I think youth recognize this is their future, and adults in the room, you're just not doing enough. So I think getting the youth to engage and mobilize and share their views about the need to build a healthy and vibrant future for them is absolutely critical to developing solutions.
Agreed. Perhaps Kevin can speak directly to youth engagement around this strategy, but I definitely agree that it's an important point. And my own research within the disaster realm that we do at Urban Institute is really around children's disaster preparedness and recovery. And I'd say that there's really a changing tide where that work used to be all about vulnerability, how we can protect children, what they need, how other people can speak for them post-disaster. And now it's really shifting to that point of agency, which also means there needs to be a balance, right? Because you can have the agency, but there are shocks and stresses, things that could be dangerous. So what are meaningful ways for engagement? So thank you for bringing that up.
I know at my house it's a continued topic of discussion. My daughter's actually a very serious student. Compare my son, but we can maybe not go there. But she's participated in multiple walkouts at her middle school over the issues of climate change and gun violence. So I would say that, also deferring to Kevin on what the engagement process was, this plan sits squarely at the intersection of the most important issues of our day, which are also the most important issues that we're seeing coming from the kids.
That's all the time we have. I don't know if Kevin or someone wants to have some final remarks.
Good afternoon. I am Rashad Young, the City Administrator for the District of Columbia. Can we give our panelists, Christina, Kathleen, Marion, and Brandy, a hand? Thank you all so much for talking about this from really a broad perspective. Thank all of you for being here for today's release. I have a lot of thank yous, so bear with me. I want to thank the mayor certainly for her leadership in seeing this road and recognizing this opportunity that was with us to partner with the Rockefeller Foundation and 100 Resilient Cities. There was no one who was more committed and excited about this opportunity to launch this endeavor than was Mayor Bowser. When we applied for this opportunity, we didn't know that there'd be such a rich and robust partnership on the horizon. But all of you did who participated in our city and our nation's capital is really now more prepared than ever to be a worldwide leader in this resilience work. Michael, thank you to you and your team at 100 RC for your partnership and your leadership as well. I certainly do think that this has created and continued a global movement for this kind of work. Clarence Anthony and the National League of Cities team, thank you for hosting us and for supporting us and the work, and thank you for the important work that you do all across this country for cities and mayors that really gets at the heart of issues that cities are working on each and every day. As we heard today, cities around the world are addressing unprecedented challenges: inequality, climate change, cyber crime, to just name a few. But in the District of Columbia, we're not burying our heads in the sand. We've decided to lead. We've set a bold vision, and we're ready to show the world how we respond to 21st century changes and challenges. So through Resilient RC, our Resilient DC, we're aligning our major planning efforts into a coordinated strategy to accelerate the action and embed equity and resilience efforts throughout district government. And we know that building resilience requires that government, philanthropy, and the community all come together and address these challenges. So I'm really excited that this work is housed in the Executive Office of the Mayor, and with Kevin's continued leadership will maintain a real significant focus on implementation. So I've had the opportunity to work in cities, a few cities across the country, and I know the biggest challenge is to take a plan and turn it into reality. So that's precisely what we're going to do in the District of Columbia. Let me say thanks to the folks that really worked to put this together: our Chief Resilience Officer, Kevin Bush, the Deputy Resilience Officer Harrison Newton, Ayanna Rocket. Let's give them a round of applause. Throughout this process, the team worked diligently with Mayor Bowser's Resilience Cabinet, many of whom are here today. A number of our directors are here. If you just raise your hand, Resilience Cabinet members, just thank you all for your leadership. And so in closing, we look forward to continuing to lead on this effort, to work with all the people who have given input and participated in this process to extend the reach of that engagement as we shift to implementation phase to really execute the Resilient DC strategy. If anybody knows anything about me, I do not like to plan just for planning's sake. We have to be about doing things and action, and so that's what we're moving to as well. I see our friends from Federal City Council here, Kevin Clinton, the business community. There's so many people that inputted into this process, and so I thank them all, and we look forward to moving to the next phase. So thank you for joining us here today.